That's right. Good. Very good summary. So when the story opens, Gideon and his family are definitely not practicing worship to Jehovah. They have gone over to idolatry, to particular Baal and Ashtaroth, which would have been gods of the Canaanites and the people they were supposed to dispossess and run out and kill. Those gods linger and pervert the religion of at least of Gideon's family. And it's actually the community. We're going to find out the community at large is also very much a follower of Baal and Ashtoreth. Okay, so Gideon, he decides to destroy his father's altar to Baal and the Ashtoreth pole. When does he do it? What's significant? He does it at night. Why does he do it at night? He is terrified. We know that Gideon, this is the interesting thing, when the story opens, Gideon is is sifting wheat, and he's doing it in a wine press. Why? Because he's afraid. Then when he is finally convinced that he needs to tear down these altars to these other gods, he does it at night because he's afraid. Contrast what Gideon is going to do here in a moment. Significant change in Gideon. We read over this a lot of times like, oh yeah, he was scared, now he's not. Think about that for a moment. He had reason to be afraid of the Midianites, which is why he was threshing wheat in a wine press. He had reason to fear his father and his community at large, which is why he tore these things down at night. This same man who is fearful for good reason suddenly becomes a very bold military leader. What changes between those 2 points? Oh yeah, you could say success. Yeah, that's right. He's going to lead an army against one of the most powerful neighbors they have. They've been subjugated, I think it was 7 years if I remember from last week. So 7 years they've been oppressed by these people. What changes in Gideon is God. He is visited by an angel. The angel calls him, "O man of valor," which we kind of chuckled at last week because he's not acting like a man of valor. But he is going to become what God sees. Is that true for us? Does God see us who we are today or in our full potential? Our full potential. So when he says, "Oh man of valor," it's because he knows Gideon is a man of valor. He just doesn't realize it yet. And so he goes through a couple of tests. One of the tests we read last week, he says, look, if you're truly who you say you are, prove it to me. What's the test? Uh-huh. That's right. That's coming up. That's right. That's the next test. And we're going to come to that because you think Gideon is good at this point. And what I love about the story of Gideon, it mirrors Moses. God, he has an interaction with God. Moses is a man who doesn't truly appreciate who he is yet. God says, you're going to go do this. He gives a lot of reasons why he shouldn't be the man. God says, I'm telling you, go do this. And then again, Moses is going to say, I need you to really make sure this is true. Well, Gideon does the same thing. The first test is, prove you are who you say you are. And the angel says, okay, bring out your food, put your bread and your meat on a rock. And then he says, pour the broth over it, which reminds me of Elijah, how he wets it, and then he prays to God, and the fire comes. And the angel touches his staff to it. What happens? Burns it up. And the interesting thing is the story says the angel just is gone. Now, we don't know if he walked away and Gideon wasn't paying attention or if he just disappeared, but he's not there. He's there one minute, he's not there the next. Gideon realizes that he had heard a message from God. This is what I love about Gideon, a man who was not raised to fear Jehovah. He knew the stories of Jehovah. When he meets the angel, he says, I'm well acquainted with what God used to do, but why has God allowed this to happen to us? Where are his miracles today? The angel performs a miracle. Gideon gets the message. He goes and tears down the altar and the Ashtoreth pole. He does that because God tells him to do that. Now, we find this in verse number 27. He does it at night. 28 is going to be the comeuppance. Now he's going to have to face the consequences for his faith. If we ended in verse 27, isn't that a wonderful story? See, God tells you to do something. He obeyed. Isn't Gideon a wonderful man? But the Bible's great in showing us the consequences for faith? What's the consequence when he wakes up the next morning? What's the reality Gideon could be facing? Yeah, not just, oh, we're sorry, we don't like you anymore. We're going to peacefully lay you down and inject you with the drug where you just quietly pass away. It would have been brutal, brutal murder. So he goes to bed doing what God told him to do. The next morning he could be facing the consequences for his faith. Verse number 28, read 28 through 31. Anyone? Okay, hold right there for just a moment. Pause, put your finger right there. Gordon, we're going to have you come back to finish that story in a moment. They go to the father. Whose altar and whose Ashtoreth pole was that he tore down? It was who? It was his father's. The people find out it is Gideon, and they go to who? His father. Who was it who instilled in this family of faith in Baal and Ashtoreth? His father. So here's a big moment. Gordon, go ahead.
But Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a God, let him plead for himself because his altar has been torn down.
Okay, so they go to Gideon's father. They say, look what your son has done. The community is upset. What does that tell us, too, that the community is worshiping at an altar that belongs to Gideon's father? What does it tell us about Gideon's father? He was a powerful leader. He was probably wealthy, which is why he built the altar, and he was influential in his community, which is why the community did whatever he was doing. So they find out, they go tell daddy, hey, look what your son did. What is the father's response? It's genius. The response he gives is the perfect response. If he had just come out and said, go away, my son did the right thing, then he might have faced the wrath of the crowd. But his response is what? Let Baal do what? If Baal's really a god, Baal will take care of this. Then he says this threat. What's the threat? What's the threat in that statement? Okay, Joash is a powerful person. He's wealthy. He's got lots of servants. He's got money and he's got influence. He says, you want to contend for Baal? What happens to you? You can be dead by morning. What's the message to the crowd? Touch my son and you'll die. Now, I think this is important because Joash could have taken a very different tack. Remember, he is not an open believer of Jehovah. Now, he may have a belief in Jehovah. He may have said, yes, I know he is a God, but he is certainly not a Jehovah worshiper. We know that because he has an altar to Baal and an Ashtoreth pole. But here's a moment where he hears what his son does. We have no record that his son went and explained his action like, Dad, I had an angel come. Go ahead, Gordon.
You know, it appears by what he did, though, he circumvented what the crowd, what the people wanted, because he did, and he defended his son, but he didn't come right out and say, don't, like you suggested, he didn't come right out and say, well, if you touch my son, then you're going to die. He somehow circumvented what their thoughts were to make them
Well, I think you'd be going too far to say that instantly he woke up and no longer had faith in Baal and Ashtoreth. I think his statement at the end is a genuine statement of faith, which is, if my son has wronged Baal, and Baal is who we think he is, Baal's going to take care of it. Let Baal deal with this. But I do think there is a threat in there, which says, if you try to take matters into your own hand, you're going to deal with me, not just with Baal. That's the way I read it. Now, significant because he could have said, take my son and stone him, which would have been the response of most Jews. If they had blasphemed against Jehovah, they were commanded to do that very same thing. He doesn't do that. He gives, in what I think is a brilliant response to save his son and give his son a chance to prove his innocence. And so what happens in the next verse? Somebody read verse 32.
So the day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal continue with him, because he broke down Baal's altar.
Okay, so as you're going through the Old Testament, when you see the name Jerubbaal in a couple of locations, sometimes it's used interchangeably, like literally in the same verse, it'll say Gideon, who is Jerubbaal. You need to remember it's the same person. As a matter of fact, in the next chapter, they're going to start with Jerubbaal. So remember that we're talking about the same person. What does Jerubbaal mean? Mark? Yeah, if you break it down, it almost literally means one who wrestles with Baal. One who wrestles with Baal. Who do we remember was known for wrestling with the god? Jacob, right? He wrestled with God, with an angel all night long, and he touched his hip, dislocated it, and the battle was over. Okay, so we have another example of somebody being given a name that contends with the god. Mark?
Well, I was just going to say that, there's one other part of the story that Gideon wasn't the only one that was involved in that. There were 10 other people.
Mm-hmm.
And as often happens, when something bad happens, and they say, we did it, I'm sure that all of them said, we did it, but he made us do it. There was nothing said about the 10 other people. Them being punished for tearing down the altars and participating in this all.
Yeah. Well, and candidly, the people who were with him may not have had a choice. They could have been servants and they were told, go do this. And then when they're told, did you do this? Yes, but Gideon's the one who made us do it. It's a good point. You have a lot of friends when things are good, very few when things are bad. All right, so where are we? I hope I didn't leave the rest of that. Okay. All right, so let's go to verses 34 and 35.
But the Spirit of the Lord came down upon Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Levites gathered around behind him. And he sent messengers through all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them.
So notice the change here. In just a few verses, the people were at his father's doorstep, ready to deliver vengeance on Gideon. Few verses later, what happens? That's right. It's big change. So what is it that, I have an opinion. I'm curious your opinion. What changed the hearts and the minds of the people to go from, we are here to put your son to death, to, hey, your son called us to arms, and we're here? Because the Abiezrites would have been his family, his direct sub-clan. So why? What changed? Well, that's right. Baal didn't kill him, so they could say, well, maybe he was right. What was the other thing that happened in these verses? That's right. His father stood up for him. And it was his father saying, hey, if Baal is against this, Baal's going to take care of it. But if Baal is for this, then you should not be involved in this. You should leave this alone. And so the people rallied to him. Who else rallies to Gideon? So we have the Spirit of the Lord, and then not only the Abiezrites, and not only the tribe of Manasseh, who else? Okay, so we have, and this is what's interesting throughout the book of Judges, rarely do you find the entire 12 tribes of Israel assemble. Usually what you see is a collection of tribes. And you remember in Deborah, we had some tribes who just decided not to show up. And when Deborah wrote a song, she excoriated them, called them out for being cowardly. In this case, there's a call that goes out, and some of the tribes respond. Now, we're going to find out, I think the number in the next chapter is about 22,000, if I remember the number right. That's a big army. That's a very big army. Think of 22,000. In today's parlance, if you go to Bank of America Stadium, how many does that seat? Like 50,000? 70. So a third of those people are showing up to go to battle. That's a big group of people. Now, remember, there's no provision here for a protracted war. If you know anything about studying warfare, more work is done in the preparation for war than actually happens in the war. It takes a lot of work to plan to make sure that there's tents, and there's shoes, and there's jackets, and there's animals to carry everything, and you got food stores, and you got to protect your supply chain. This is not going to be one of those protracted long wars. This is a war where people show up, they do their business, and then they go back home, which actually is kind of what happens through most of Israel's history. It's kind of, we show up, we do our thing, and then we go home. So we have this group of people show up. Things are looking favorable for Gideon. Then we find, Mark, you want to read 36 through 40.
Then Gideon said to God, "You will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken. Behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken." And it was so. When he arose early the next morning to squeeze the fleece, and drain the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground." God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground.
Okay, so the first test is what? We put the fleece out in both situations, but he asked God to do what in the first test? Okay, why doesn't the story stop there? Why doesn't Gideon go, oh yeah, look, it's wet, I wrung out a lot of water and the ground was dry. Yay, God, let's go. Why? Okay, you could say he's still scared. What do we know fleece will have a tendency to do? Collects liquid, right? If you put it out and it gets humid out, it could dry up and the ground could dry up. The fleece could still be damp. So it wasn't enough for him to say, okay, the fleece is damp. The next one is, now do the impossible. Because the fleece will collect water, but if it's dry, everything else has to be dry. So now I want you to reverse that process. Now, God doesn't get mad at this. As a matter of fact, God doesn't get mad at this when this happens in a number of examples where somebody is called by God and they say, God, look, you've already proven this to me, but one more time. Why doesn't God get angry at Gideon for this? Okay, he's patient. Good.
Abraham did the same thing.
Abraham, he certainly did.
When he argued with God regarding, can you find 10 people, 20 people, on a house?
That's right. We have a number of examples where men of God challenge God. Now, they do it in a respectful way, right? Even Gideon says, look, God, don't let your anger kindle against me, but please do this for me. God allows this because think of it from Gideon's standpoint. Gideon had never had any real contact with Jehovah. He had heard these stories of what Jehovah had done, but he'd never witnessed anything. And then this angel shows up and his life changes in an instant. Now, he's got this army. Wouldn't you want to say, okay, before I go lead these men to their death, let's just make sure you and I are still in alignment here. Are you still with this venture? If I go forward, just give me a sign that lets me know that you're going to be with us. If God's with them, what does that mean? They're going to win. So I would say it's not necessarily a lack of faith because he knows if God's with them, they're going to win, which is what he's testing, right? He's just trying to make sure God is with them in this venture. So what does that tell us for us, though? How does that apply to us today? We do know that, right? That's the whole point of the book of Revelations that Howard is studying. If you want to remember one thing, and usually I just say right underneath the title Revelations, we win, It's the only thing you remember from the book of Revelation. It's the only thing you need to know. What does that tell us, though, today? If God is okay with Abraham and Moses and Gideon and all these people saying, God, I just want to make sure you're with me on this venture, what does that mean for us?
He understands people have doubts.
Okay, he knows we're humans, and he knows that we have limitations, and he's okay working through those doubts and fears. Good. What else?
But he wants us to ask him to test that faith.
That's right, because our understanding, I could be here, you could be here, we hear an angel, and you and I come away with two very different messages, right? Because sometimes we hear what we want to hear. So, God, I want to just make sure I heard you right. Is this really what you want me to do? So that's how I see this interaction. It's Gideon, not necessarily in a lack of faith, but in a moment to say, look, I want to make sure that before I proceed, this is what you want me to do. And so God delivers that, right? He does what he asked him to do. We're going to find out in chapter 7, Gideon then does what God asked him to do. Right? It's a beautiful story. So let's go to chapter 7. Questions, comments? John?
We know it's easy to fool ourselves, so we hear what we want to hear. So I think it's more of he's questioning himself more than God.
We have a period of like 300 years where Christendom believed that God wanted them to go and eradicate Muslims from the Holy Land. Was that God's will for them to wage war for 300 years? Questionable. But you know what? They were convinced. So much so they gave up gold. They gave up prestige. They gave up their lives. Some of them died horrible, just terrible deaths. But they heard what they wanted to hear, right? We can do that too today, right? We can fall into the same trap. So it's okay to question your motives. Is this really what God wants or needs me to do? Okay, chapter 7. We've been building up to chapter 7. Everything in chapter 6 is to set the stage for chapter 7. It's to explain what's going to happen. In chapter 6, there's a prophet that comes to the people to make sure they understand why they're in this state. Why does the prophet tell them they're suffering at the hands of these people? What does he say in short? Because you have sinned. You're being punished because you have sinned. Make no mistake, this isn't some world power balance. This isn't your economic system's inferior to theirs. This is because you have disobeyed me and I'm teaching you a lesson. Now God is going to deliver them. Chapter 7. Somebody read verses 1. Let's see, 1 through... Yeah, let's go 1 through 3.
In Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them, by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let them turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained.
So it's 32,000. Sorry, I remembered 22,000. I think I said that before. So there's some 32,000 people ready to go to battle. God says what? This is great. Let's go do it. Is that what he says? What's he say? There's too many. If you go to battle like this, you're going to think you did this, right? So we're going to winnow this down. So then he says, if there's anybody here that's afraid, do what? Now, I put myself on this day in the line, and Gideon is walking across the line of army, and he says, anybody afraid can go home. Gut check time. I can go home. Nobody's going to say anything to me. I'm not going to be stabbed through for abandoning my comrades. I can just go home and live another day. I think I'm one of the guys who would have been packing up in that note. I'd have rationalized this and said, well, God must want me to go home because guess what? I am afraid. 22,000 people leave. Imagine if you're the 10,000 guys still standing there. I wasn't afraid before. Now I'm having second thoughts. Hold that thought because it's not over yet. So we're down to 10,000. Let's read verses 4 through 7.
Bring them down to the water, and I will test them through there. Then it will be that if
32,000 people show up for battle. God says, too many, 22,000 go home. 10,000 are sitting there looking to their left and right going, maybe I should have gone home too. And then God says, wait, still too many. You're still going to think you did this by your own strength. We're going to winnow them one more time. How many people are left? 300 people. 300 people. That's a very small force going against a very large superior force. What do we know, generally speaking, when a smaller force is fighting a larger force? Strategically, what do you want to do? Do you want to do it on an open plain? Why? They're going to do an enveloping action and surround you, and then it's just going to be there's going to be death everywhere. There's nobody going to escape. You'll be eradicated, not even decimated. What does decimated mean? That's right. That's all it means. Back then, historical loss was 1/10 of your army was wiped out. If they were to go 300 men against a larger army in an open plain, it would have been suicide. It had been done. Now, a lot of people will spend, and I know we're out of time, so I'm going to try and get to this quickly. A lot of people will read this passage and they'll try to twist a lot of meaning out of what God does here. What's the differentiator between those who fight and those who go home? What's it say here? What's the test? How they drink water. What an arbitrary way to pick who's going to go to battle. Not everybody 6'4" and above. Those guys are going to stay. All the short guys can go home. No. It's how they drink water. Now, there's a confusing part here, and I want to call it out if you read it. In one verse, it sounds like lapping versus those who kneel. And the next verse, it almost sounds like he picks both of them because he talks about those who use their hand to their mouth. Just know there is some debate whether the grammar has been spliced right here in one of the copyists, but it doesn't matter. What matters in all of this is God says 32,000 is too many, 10,000 is too many, 300 is just the right size. What's the purpose in 300 going against this large army? There's no way you can claim victory unless it's by God's hand himself. All right, so we're going to pick up here next week in verse number 7. Thank you.